Warning: this episode contains details that some listeners may find disturbing. In the late 1500s, a series of mutilated animals and missing children terrified the people of Germany near the town of Bedburg. Rumors spread through taverns, shops, and homes that a creature was to blame. A creature born of sin, half man, half wolf. Authorities arrested a prosperous farmer named Peter Stumpp. He would soon confess to unspeakable acts of cannibalism and sorcery. On Halloween night in 1581, Peter suffered one of the most brutal public executions in history. But was Stumpp really a monster, or a victim of superstition, torture, and political malice? Tonight, we explore the sensational case of the Werewolf of Bedburg. But of all other that ever lived, none was comparable unto this hellhound, whose tyranny and cruelty did well declare he was of his father, the devil, who was a murderer from the beginning. That is a quote from The Damnable Life and Death of one Stubbe Peter, a most wicked sorcerer. This is a study of strange. Welcome back to the show. I am Michael. I'm getting over a cold, so my voice might sound a little nasally and weird, or perhaps more sexy than normal. You're welcome. If you're new to the show, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. That's literally the best thing you can do to support us. It helps us grow, so thank you so much. Now, on today's topic, most of what we now know about the Peter Stumpp story comes from one source, a pamphlet published soon after Stumpp's execution, but it's a translation of a German original, and the German original has not been found. And this translation was found by occultist and writer Montague Summers in the early 1900s. Montague Summers is somebody I've had it on my list to do an episode about him. He's a very interesting person, to say the least, and that's for a different episode. I won't go into it now, but some people have doubted the authenticity of this source. And when you read about Peter Stumpp online, everybody says, hey, everything we know comes from this pamphlet. Well, that's not true, because there's about 5 different documents relating to the Peter Stumpp story out there. There's some minor differences in each, which should be expected from this time period, and this includes a diary and wood carvings and things like that. Now, before we get into that, though, we have to ask where the werewolf legends come from. So let's get into it. Stories of humans turning into wolves goes back millennia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is roughly 4,000 years old, a hero refuses the love of the goddess Ishtar when he learns that she once turned a former lover into a wolf. There are many accounts of varying degrees of scorned lovers becoming wolves or being turned into wolves from early European folklore that might have spread because of the tale of Gilgamesh. It's like a Hollywood movie inventing the idea that a werewolf can be killed by a silver bullet, and then the silver bullet becomes part of the lore of the werewolf. Greek mythology offered a similar tale. King Lycaon of Arcadia dared Zeus to prove his omniscience by serving him disguised human flesh. In punishment, Zeus transformed Lycaon into a wolf. From this myth, we derive the word lycanthropy, meaning both the act of becoming a wolf and the delusion of being one. I'll take this moment to say go back and listen to my werewolf serial killer story that I published a few years ago for more of that. The medieval ages treated lycanthropy as a very real threat. St. Augustine wrote that it is generally believed that, by certain witches' spells, men may be turned into wolves. Early English law codes warned against werewolves, which in fact comes from an Old English word meaning man-wolf. The chronicler Gervase of Tilbury claimed in the 13th century that people in England often changed into wolves. It was the Middle Ages, religion was the hot topic of the day, so the werewolf became a legend associated with devils and demons and the like. Our modern thoughts around werewolves are influenced by these thousands of years of folklore, legend, and myth, but Hollywood has had a greater effect on the modern lore of the werewolf. Full moons, I already mentioned the silver bullet, a lot of that is just Hollywood inventions, and you might have been aware of that. But what you might not be aware of was that there was a werewolf panic in Europe. By the 15th century, the belief that humans could become wolves was intertwined with the witch hunts that were sweeping Europe. Wolves were Europe's most feared predators, attacking livestock and occasionally humans, in areas where forests and pastoral economies were right up against each other coexisting, especially parts of Germany and France. Fear of wolves blossomed into fears of demonic wolves. Religious wars, famine, and plague heightened anxieties, and between the 15th and 18th century, Europe saw about 300 recorded werewolf trials, a very small number compared to the tens of thousands of witch prosecutions, but still an extraordinary number. During the Valais trials of the 1420s, Swiss authorities accused men and women of both witchcraft and adopting wolf form to mutilate cattle. In 1521, papal inquisitors in France tried shepherds Pierre Bourgeot and Michel Verdun for making a pact with a black-clad stranger who gave them an ointment to transform into wolves. That's something you usually see in the medieval werewolf stories. There's usually an ointment or clothing that someone puts on which changes them into a wolf. It's not the full moon that we think of now. During these various trials, men usually confessed, always after torture, to attending nocturnal witch gatherings and hunting children. Subsequent werewolf trials shared very common features to this story. There's usually a bargain with the devil, torture, followed by confession to stop said torture, and sometimes naming names. That was always a big part of the witch trials, is, hey, name names, tell us who else is a witch, and we'll stop the torture and kill you faster. It was a way to get out of the pain and cannot be trusted. It's a very archaic way of doing things. And that brings us to the case of Peter Stumpp. Peter Stumpp, whose name was spelled a variety of ways like Stumpf, or you'll hear him referred to as Stuba or Stube. He was a prosperous farmer born around 1530 near Bedburg in the electorate of Cologne. According to some accounts, he was missing his left hand, and the surname Stumpp or Stumpf may have been a nickname referring to this injury. Stumpp was most likely a Protestant, and that is an important part of this story I'll circle back to later. And by the 1580s, he was a widower with 2 children, a daughter Beal, sometimes called Sybil, and a son. We do not know the son's name, and I'll also mention that a few of the accounts don't mention Stumpp being a farmer. I think one of them says he's a landlord. Our main source is the pamphlet I've mentioned because it has the most information, but there are no official court records of Stumpp's trial. The full title of this pamphlet is A True Discourse Declaring the Damnable Life and Death of One Stube Peter, a Most Wicked Sorcerer. In it, it says that it is printed in London in 1590, and the pamphlet claims to translate this lost German original. Only 2 copies of this pamphlet are known to exist. One is in a British museum and another in the Lambeth Library. The pamphlet sets this up as a morality tale to scare people away from witches and other demonic things, but it states that it is a true story. According to the pamphlet, Stumpp made a pact with the devil at age 12. Satan supposedly gave him a magic girdle that, when worn, transformed him into a werewolf. Here's a quote. The devil who saw him a fit instrument to perform mischief, as a wicked fiend pleased with the desire of wrong and destruction, gave unto him a girdle, which being put about him, he was straight transformed into the likeness of a greedy devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like unto brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body, and mighty paws. And no sooner should he put off the same girdle, but presently he should appear in his former shape, according to the proportion of a man, as if he had never been changed. So that last sentence there is about him removing the belt, the girdle, and that returned him to human form whenever he shall please. One of the other documents, I'll say, mentions a belt given to him by the devil, and just to clarify, in the manner of speaking at that time, a girdle and belt for a man were roughly the same thing. Peter Stumpp allegedly used this power to stalk the fields around Bedburg for 25 years, murdering anyone who angered him or crossed his path. The pamphlet accuses Stumpp of many crimes: serial murder and cannibalism. He supposedly killed 13 or 14 children. Some of the other documents mention more. He killed 2 pregnant women, tearing out their fetuses and eating their hearts. One victim was reportedly his own son, whose brain he ate. And he also gorged on livestock such as goats, lambs, and sheep. Here's another quote. "There were not long ago certain small children playing in a meadow together hard by the town, where also some store of kine were feeding, many of them having young calves sucking upon them. And suddenly among these children comes this wild wolf running, and caught a pretty fine girl by the collar with intent to pull out her throat. But such was the will of God that he could not pierce the collar of the child's coat, being high and very well stiffened, and close clasped about her neck. And therewithal the sudden great cry of the rest of the children which escaped, so amazed the cattle feeding by, that being fearful to be robbed of their young, they altogether came running against the wolf with such force that he was presently compelled to let go his hold and run away and escape." Stumpp was also accused of incest and adultery. He apparently fathered a child with his daughter Beale. He seduced a married woman named Catherine Tropin, described as his neighbor. He also slept with a demonic being that was being sent by the devil. We don't know much about how the authorities were able to gather evidence or what evidence they had that Stumpp had done all of this, but the story goes that a group of hunters were able to eventually surround Stumpp as he was in wolf form. They corner him, and he removed his girdle as if to appear to a man. This is told in the pamphlet in such a way to almost make it seem like he tried to hide the fact that he was removing his girdle so he could just appear and be like, "Hey, what are you guys doing out here?" But that did not work. It just made the hunters realize that he was indeed a werewolf. So they capture him and they put him on the rack, which is a torture device. Facing this torture, he allegedly voluntarily confessed his whole life and said that he had taken his girdle when he took it off and threw it into the valley. The magistrates searched for this belt, but they found nothing. His daughter Beale and his mistress Catherine Tropin were deemed accomplices to all of his horrors, and after due examination, they were condemned right alongside of him. On Halloween night, 1589, Stumpp was executed, and it was, well, for lack of a better term, just insane. His execution has become infamous for its brutality. Executioners tied him to a cartwheel and tore his flesh from his body using red-hot pincers in 10 different places. They then broke his arms and his legs with the back side of an X. They beheaded him and then burned his body. His daughter and Catherine Tropin were flayed, strangled, and burned right alongside of him. As a warning, authorities erected a very tall pole in town They put up the torture wheel that they had used to dismember him, and at the top they put a carved wolf, and at the summit they placed Stumpp's head. And that is the conclusion of Peter Stumpp's life. That is essentially all we know. But how much of this story is true, if any of it? Modern historians treat this case with caution, and rightly so. There is very little evidence that any of this took place because there are no trial records or anything like that. A lot of the witch trials, as an example, we have surviving court documents. We also have to look at the way Stumpp's name varies in various accounts, even though that's kind of typical for this time period, and there's also translations and things like that. We do have to consider that as we piece this together. But some tales, especially when we have at least 5 different existing documents that we know of that cover this case, have some basis in reality. And there are a number of different theories about what actually happened. I'll start with one of the more dramatic and provocative ideas. Peter Stumpp was a serial killer. The argument here is that there was no term for a serial killer back then. People didn't know what that was. So if somebody had been murdering multiple people, the crimes get sensationalized, the beliefs and religiosity of the time adds supernatural elements to the story. It's a way to explain these evil deeds. And there's a suggestion that werewolf legends were used to explain serial killings. Another theory is that this is all just political propaganda. The electorate of Cologne was torn by religious war in the 1580s, and Stumpp was a Protestant in a region reconquered by Catholic forces. There is some mention that there were aristocrats and a Catholic elector at Peter Stumpp's execution, and this suggests a public spectacle that had some political affiliation to it and could have been used to intimidate the remaining Protestants in the area. They portrayed Stumpp as this demonic force, this werewolf, and that justified the harsh punishment and the torturous execution. The next theory is that Peter Stumpp was a scapegoat of superstition. Many accused werewolves, much like many accused witches, were marginalized individuals. Fear of wolves, disease, famine, plague, this made communities eager for people to blame. Under torture, people would confess to impossible acts like shape-shifting, being a witch, or being a werewolf. I've covered this in the Connecticut Witch Trials episode and my Salem Witch Trials episode, but a lot of times communities would benefit from somebody being accused of something like a witch, and if they had been killed or kicked out of town, the community would then inherit that person's wealth, land, etc. So there is motivation for the community to turn against somebody like Peter Stumpp if they didn't like him. And they might not have liked him because he was Protestant. They might not have liked him just because they didn't like him. They might not have liked his daughter. Or if he was having an affair with this Catherine person in this very conservative community, that might have been enough for people to turn against him and then either make up rightly or create it in their own minds just to justify their hatred of him. They say that he's performing these demonic acts and he's a werewolf. The last theory I'll propose is that this is a combination of everything. Peter Stumpp was living in a world of intense superstition and religion. There's also a ton of political propaganda and influence, and Stumpp may have been a killer, or maybe he was just having an affair, or maybe the community wanted his property. Any of those things combined with the mix of propaganda and superstition to make people turn against him and accuse him of being a werewolf. Despite the questionable veracity, the questions of the authenticity of this story, I believe Peter Stumpp was real. Do I believe he was a werewolf? No, of course I don't. But I believe he was arrested, accused, and under torture made a false confession. Even with the lack of court records, the fact that we have broadsheets, we have woodcut illustrations, we have the pamphlet that all show Stumpp being executed, describing his execution, to me, that is enough to say that there are multiple angles of this story that all share most of the same details. And to me, that makes this a very valid story that this actually happened. And the horror of his deeds, the horror of the gruesome end that he went through that turned Peter Stumpp into this archetypal werewolf of Bedburg, which undoubtedly inspired lore, legend, and beliefs of the time, not to mention inspiring later fiction about werewolves. And now a final quote from the damnable life and death of one Stumpp Peter, a most wicked sorcerer. Thus, gentle reader, have I set down the true discourse of this wicked man, Stumpp Peter, which I desire to be a warning to all sorcerers and witches, which unlawfully follow their own devilish imagination to the utter ruin and destruction of their souls eternally, from which wicked and damnable practice I beseech God keep all good men, and from the cruelty of their wicked hearts. Amen. You've just listened to A Study of Strange. Consider helping us keep the lantern lit, illuminating the unexplained, by subscribing to our Substack. Just head to the support tab at astudyofstrange.com. Until next time, stay curious and stay strange.